Thank you both for being here today. The topic of our discussion today is the history of the community. So Tony Brooks and Dr. Helen Davis have been both staples within the community for a number of years. So to kind of kick off the discussion, I want to put out the topic of how has the local regional perception changed of the LGBT community in the past 20 to 30 years? Helen, I know you're a transplant to the area.
I am.
Do you want to talk a little bit maybe about where you were and how you saw that change, and especially in this area in the time you've been here?
Sure. I can't cover 20 to 30 years, but I can cover 12 to 13 years, if that helps. I moved here in 2008 from New York City, but before New York City, I lived in North Carolina, pretty rural North Carolina. So this is somewhere in between, I would say. And I have seen significant positive change since I moved here in 2008. I've seen significant change in the Valley. I've seen significant change on campus at Wilkes, and so we still have miles to go before we sleep, but we have made some great progress. I see much more activism. I also see much more comfort with LGBT couples just interacting with people, which I find as a really important anecdotal piece of evidence for the comfort level of the community and the feeling of our community being part of the larger community in a comfortable way, which I think is really critically important. I've also seen our Pride Fest go from protesters and orange tape and protective umbrellas to protect the people attending to it just being an event that happens every year when we can meet in person, and it's not something that we have to worry so much about. So, I know there's a lot of negative that we could focus on right now, but it's nice to step back and see how much progress we really have made.
Awesome. Thank you, Helen. Tony, how do you feel the perception has changed in the past 20 to 30 years?
So top of my mind, in the greatest change would be marriage equality. And I go beyond 30 years. Matter of fact, I was calculating 38 years of activism. But my husband and I were the very first marriage license in Luzerne County. There were 5 issued on that day. We got up really early to get there at 9 o'clock thinking there's going to be this line, and there was no line. There was just Matthew and I. But the great story of this is we went in, filled out the paperwork. What was interesting, it was just the day after the court case. So the county did not change the pronouns, the husband and wife names for the license. So I'll let you figure out who chose to be the wife and who chose to be the husband, but we keep that little marriage license. But after we filled out all the paperwork and got our marriage license, the register of wills, which happened to be someone I was acquainted with, came out and clapped, and the entire office clapped for us.
That's right.
Oh, wow.
Completely different from Karen Davis down in Kentucky. So we had a completely different experience. That actually surprised me. I just thought it would be maybe routine. Okay, here's your license, go on. No, I mean, they were ready to have a party. So that is a fantastic change that was happened. And I think the other biggest change is we are now electing openly gay officials.
That's right.
Me being the first, and Jessica Rothschild in Scranton being one, and Justin Carell up in Laurel Run. So we have out open officials, and when you have a place at the table, things really change.
That's right. And our non-discrimination ordinances, too, that we've managed to pass in our local area. We have still trying to get our state non-discrimination ordinances passed, but we had Dorrance, Scranton's had one for a long time. We had Pittston do theirs. They were one of the early adopters, and then, finally Wilkes-Barre was able to join the party. So it was really great to have Tony on council when that happened, and Beth's leadership to help get that bill through. So, those are really important, because when you have those kinds of structural changes in laws, changes in rights, that's when you know that you have protection that can't just be taken away again.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and within the history of context, we tried back in 1994 My mother happens to be one of the leaders of the gay community in northeastern Pennsylvania for many years. She's now, I won't give her age away, but she started her activism in her 40s, and now she's in a retirement community doing very, very well. But back in 1994, when we first tried non-discrimination, her and Jim Harrington, who was a music professor at Wilkes University and a Catholic church organist as well, with the wonderful tattoo on his arm so everyone could see. So when that bill was introduced, it failed miserably. Only got one vote and 6 against. Come 22 years later, and 5-0. And I have to thank all of the colleagues, because that is a huge changed perception.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very exciting. And, you know, those are the kind of moments that I can remember when the marriage equality passed. I was driving, I had the radio on, I was listening for the announcement. I had to pull over. I was too excited to drive. I was, you know, and then we got together and we were able to celebrate as a community, which was really wonderful. But those milestones are really, really important to celebrate, especially if we feel like we're moving backwards. We have to celebrate the progress we've made.
Absolutely.
Awesome. In your time in the community, were there any specific leaders that may have helped pave the way, either for you specifically or for the community at large?
I'll start. Mine happens to be my mother, Emily Novakowski, who was very involved from the very beginning in the early 1990s. Her and others started an organization called REACH, which had a lot of social programs. And one of the most important programs she had was a anti-suicide teenage program. And she called it her boys. And she has lots of graduates of this program. They're still out and around in the community. And that was at Family Services Association and at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church.
Wow.
And doing that. And then helping other parents. So my mother created PFLAG of Northeastern Pennsylvania back in 1993. And it's still going on, other leadership with it today. And that's another thing that we need to reach out and examine, is the parents of people and how they help each other through the social support, system. And Jim Harrington, which I already mentioned before, the work that he did. And then also in the early days, there were a lot of leaders like Alison Maslow in creating an organization called SPARC, which stood for State of Pennsylvania Rights Coalition, which was one of the forerunners of Equality PA.
Oh, wow.
And she was on the state board of that as well.
Well, obviously I came in a little later, but I was brought into the NEPA Rainbow Alliance by 2013. I was on the board, so I moved here in 2008, started my activism on campus, and joined the board in 2013 and stayed there. And so there were many local community members who were board members with me across the 2013 to 2018 while I was on the board. So it was really great because I got to meet so many active community members, and then so many community members in general. Kelly Novakowski was on the board for me for a number of years, your cousin. So she would talk about your mom quite a lot. With great love. So your mom is such an important part of the history of our local community. I actually, it was great. I had been as a student at Wilkes when he was an undergraduate, and then I got to serve with him on the board my last year as he was coming in. So it was really nice to have that transition. It felt really, really natural and wonderful to feel like it was passing along. But I also have a lot of non-local inspiration that I think still works locally. I'm an English professor, so as you can imagine, I have a lot of writers who are very dear to me, whose work really helped me to define myself and understand myself, and that I still use with my students to help them understand themselves. So there are many. June Jordan's one of my favorites. James Baldwin is another. But there are so many wonderful writers who have helped to articulate their experiences and connect to our experiences and theorize about those experiences. And now I also do queer and feminist theory, so all of the theoretical thought and work that has gone into understanding and explaining and exploring what our identities mean and how we understand them and how they interact with the world. So I have a lot of rather nerdy academic connections when I think of leaders as well.
Awesome. and Helen, I'm going to call you out a little bit and go a little bit off our script.
Okay.
When I was fortunate enough to be a student at Wilkes, and I know that you did a bunch of activism with the colleges, specifically putting in policies that were pro-LGBT, and doing a bunch of trainings. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, that's definitely one of the advances that I've seen in the area since I moved here. So I came here at least about a year after I started at Wilkes. I started to advocate for the building of a safe space program and awareness program. It took a couple of years to get that off the ground. It took some student demand, and we were able to get that started. But so we've had now a long-standing LGBT awareness and safe space program on campus where I give trainings and education to faculty and staff and students. And we make sure all of our RAs, for example, get basic training so they have an awareness of, how to interact with their students well and how to answer questions and how to be supportive. And then we have an ally program for people who choose to be allies to do further supportive work. We've also been able to build a number of other structural support mechanisms. We have 42 all-gender restrooms on our campus at Wilkes now. And we also have a policy that says everyone's able to use the restroom that aligns with their gender identity. So no one has to use those restrooms, of course, but it's nice to have them available. We have great housing policies that allow a lot of flexibility in terms of housing. We have great policies on name changes so that people can use their names and not be dead named. We've been working on that. That sounds like a simple thing, but the programming required for that gets rather complicated because of the way the legal requirements are for names for federal financial aid and our systems. But we've been working really hard on that. So Wilkes has really come a long way, but I've also been invited to do trainings at King's College and Misericordia University. So it hasn't just been Wilkes, and that's been really exciting for me to see that Wilkes is a non-sectarian university. So it maybe is less surprising that we were able to build such support, but to see it come into some of the Catholic universities and have support for those students is really exciting. And I just saw maybe 2 weeks ago or a week ago that the leader of the GSA at King's College has officially been able to call it a GSA
That's
for the first time, which is a major, they've been actually working on that for a number of years. So, it's been really nice to see that change. And I've also been able to work with the Susquehanna County School District to do some supportive work there to help give their teachers some education and give them some information to help support their students. So, that's something that we still need much more of. We really need student support at the high school and middle school level and knowledge and awareness. Absolutely. We still have really high suicide rates, attempted suicide rates, and the evidence shows us that one supportive adult can make a huge difference in those numbers. So by the age of 25, 40% of trans people have attempted suicide, and that number terrifies me. Terrifies me. But one supportive adult can help make a difference. And so the more we can build those support structures for our young people, the more those numbers will go down, the more bright their futures will be. So, and if we're looking at Generation Z, there are so many LGBT students in Generation Z, so many non-binary students in Generation Z, that that's the next wave, I think.
Thank you for highlighting that, because I think it's important. I think some people don't realize that there still are those strides that need to be made within the community before we could be fully equal.
Absolutely.
To continue on, are there any particular events that have significantly influenced the perception in the area on being LGBT?
I think Pride Fest is probably the most obvious, right? We were, for a long time, the only Pride Fest in the region. There are some closer to us now, so we're not quite as alone, but it's still been very groundbreaking and important to have those times to come together and to do things as a community, and they're always wonderful events. So in terms of the local community, I think that's probably been the thing with the biggest impact. We briefly had a center at the Rainbow Alliance, and that was wonderful too. I missed that. I was just looking at pictures of that recently. It was really nice to have a physical space for a little while, but the building was sold, so it got more complicated. And then, lots of community spaces, things like bars and places where people were able to hang out and socialize, which are also an important part of the community. So.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
bars definitely are an important part of the community. So when it come to history, I thought I'd do a little research about perceptions, about the use of the word homosexual versus gay, lesbian. So I did a little research for our newspapers and find that the very first time the word homosexual shows up in the Wilkes-Barre newspaper is 1927. And it was related to a play, and I love the name of this play, The Drag, a homosexual comedy. Well, the article wasn't positive, though. The article was about the censors in these particular towns where the play was showing. And the play never showed in Wilkes-Barre, but they were talking about it in Connecticut, what happened there, what happened in New Jersey. So the very, very first time, it's a negative. In the 50s, you start to see more, and that's when you first start to see the word lesbian start popping up in the local Wilkes-Barre newspapers. But yet again, all negative perceptions. We're portrayed as alcoholics, and we all die, and revengeful women. I mean, all these things that you would also see in the early days of Hollywood, how we were portrayed as well. But in the 1950s, another important thing was happening, and that was the rise of bars in Wilkes-Barre. And I was just so fortunate to have two friends in their 90s. Now, both have since passed away, one at 99 and the other one at 95. And they were both World War II veterans who came home to Wilkes-Barre. And in the 1950s, they told me there was a wonderful gay bar scene. And that's great to know.
Yeah.
Sad thing is, I never got the name of that bar because both of my friends have since died. And I still want to find out about that. But to know that they were there, and they were probably there all the time. And this is some research that I like to either foster for someone to do or I'll do myself, is the changing styles of bars over time. So when it comes to me, locally, there was a bar called Vispi's. And when I was in high school, you could, now I'm not out though in high school, and actually didn't even out to myself yet, but we would sneak into Vispi's because there was no carding in those days. And I've just learned today that there's going to be a documentary done on the disco scene of the 1970s, and they're going to talk about Vispi's.
Very
So
cool.
Visby wasn't officially gay, but everybody knew it was comfortable. And the most spectacular thing about this bar is up on the ceilings was Christmas decorations all upside down. You had a train set and all different trees,
wow.
but everything hangs
Everything's
upside down.
Huh. That's really fun.
That's
I love
incredible.
that. I love that. So our one of the reasons bars have been such an important part of LGBT history is, for a long time, there really weren't places for LGBT people to be able to come together. And, if most of our listeners know anything about LGBT history, they know about Stonewall. And Stonewall was a bar. It was run by the mob, and it was a place for people to get together. It was raided all the time, but there was an understanding that this was a place that was most of the time safe until it wasn't. But that history of having a space to come together, it has been really important. Interestingly, there are both some issues with that potentially for some people. Obviously, if you are an alcoholic who's recovering or someone who is not comfortable in that environment, it meant for a long time that there really weren't a lot of social options. There really weren't a lot of places to meet people. There weren't places to socialize. That's gotten a lot better. We have a lot more social activities and programs and things through the Rainbow Alliance and other groups that try to provide fun social options that are not just in the bars. Bars are still an important part of the culture, and we do still have some surviving places like Heat here in the area. But as the general community has gotten more accepting, the gay bar scene has declined some because there's more disbursement. And so it's interesting to see how our progress in some areas actually leads to like downward shifts in terms of bars and what they mean for our culture, but also their ability to survive and to continue to exist.
Another good example of that is bookstores. So when I was going to college in Philadelphia, Giovanni's Room was a place to go for poetry readings, book readings, a place to go get magazines and books and possibly meet somebody. And I find this really fascinating. So I'm at Giovanni's Room in the early 80s going to school. Come 40 years later, Giovanni's gets a blue Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission marker. I happened to sit at the table to review that process. And here's another great example about us being at the table, right? So I'm at the table at City Council. I happen to be at the table of this meeting with professors across the Commonwealth. And I was the only one who could speak to the fact that it's not just a bookstore. They would think it's just a bookstore. He said it's far more than a bookstore to us. It's also a community center, and that's why it should be recognized. And they got their blue historical marker.
That's fabulous.
Awesome.
And you're right, bookstores really have been in decline. Independent bookstores are almost completely gone. They're not completely gone, but really there are very few of them, and that has been really a really big blow for many communities, but especially for the LGBTQ community. That also means that it's really, really important for our public libraries to be supportive and to have books that are available and to understand something about how to list those books and post those books, especially so that youth can find out information if they need it, so that young adults can find out information. Public libraries are still a really important source of information, and I think more important now in many ways, because you can't just go into a bookstore, and it may not be as easy to just buy a book online if you're living home with parents and you're still trying to figure out who you are, for example, or things like that.
Very much so.
Awesome. To kind of keep continuing on, I know something that has been a big a point in the history of the LGBT community has been the AIDS crisis. I think that's kind of important to talk about. Were either of you old enough at that point when the crisis was going on to be able to reflect on what it was like for the community?
So I am 55 years old, and during the AIDS crisis, I was in Philadelphia and New York. So I am actually the age, that whole generation that are so many people lost. But I'm also of the generation that got the message. It'd be the first one. So Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York, AIDS Alliance in Philadelphia kept pumping out information about safe sex. Use a condom, have safe sex, all this stuff. And for me, it worked. I remember being, actually I could honestly say almost like a therapy session, being scared of having sex because of AIDS. So I just abstained for the longest time. And now I'm happily married. But it's a unbelievable impact certainly for a generation of men, particularly now 60-year-olds. There are very, very few 60-year-olds, particularly if you were openly gay when you were in your 20s and 30s and living through the 70s and 80s. So many of them are just gone. And so I did what a lot of gay men did. Actually, part of it, activism, comes from the AIDS crisis and trying to get the doctor that is still at the CDC today, Anthony Fauci, to do something. And it took him a while, but then he ended up becoming a great ally and advocate for us over time.
Wow.
So I'm a little bit younger than Tony. I'm 43, but when the AIDS crisis hit, what I remember most at the beginning of it was being in middle school and having absolutely horrendous information being given to us in what sadly counted as sex ed. It was all ridiculous, and people were afraid of ridiculous things. Don't drink from the water fountains, like things that were just absurd. So there was really not good information. We also had a president in office, Ronald Reagan, who was really using the LGBT community, especially the gay community, to be scapegoats for AIDS and blaming them and not taking it seriously enough, not providing funding, not providing accurate information, and really not trying to combat the illness. It's really due to really hard activist work on the ground and a lot of advocacy that we were able to make the progress that we did. It was kind of in spite of the systems, not as a result of the systems, unfortunately, for so long. We've come so far in terms of AIDS treatment, and but interestingly, as an educator who still talks about sex education with college students now, what I find is we've kind of gone backwards in terms of some of the information. I find a lot of my students don't really know as much as I would expect them to know about AIDS and other sexually transmitted diseases. And I think part of that is because our sex education is so heteronormative and it doesn't provide accurate information or sometimes any information for our LGBTQ youth and young adults as they're coming of age. So they just don't have as much information as they need. So it's still another area where we saw huge progress and development in treatments, in support, and in advocacy and awareness. And our generations are very aware of the history of the AIDS crisis and HIV and what to do and how to protect yourself. And people in my generation, for example, are very excited about PrEP and know all about PrEP and use PrEP. And I worry that because the urgency isn't as strong now, that we are not doing as good a job as we need to of spreading that information to make sure enough people still know.
And Helen, I'm glad you brought up PrEP. For anybody who might be listening or watching that doesn't know what that is, could you briefly just talk about it?
Sure. This is the part where I say I'm not a medical doctor. But PrEP is a drug that you can take if you were sexually active and HIV positive, or if you're afraid that you'll become HIV positive, or if you are going to be in relationships and you don't know if your partner might be HIV positive. So if you take PrEP, it will help keep you HIV negative, and it significantly, drastically reduces your chances of contracting HIV. So it's a game changer. It's a huge game changer, and it's not a cheap drug. But we do have community organizations that work really hard to try to help support and provide PrEP for at-risk communities if they need it. So if you want to know more about PrEP, and this is important to you, you can reach out to Caring Communities, you can reach out to Planned Parenthood. Those are both great organizations that can give you information about how to see if you qualify for assistance in getting PrEP and can give you more information about it.
Awesome, thank you. And one more topic that I do want to hit on that I believe kind of was a stepping stone to marriage equality, but I don't think we could talk about marriage equality without talking about DOMA and Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
Yes.
Could you both tell me your experience about when those kind of went into effect? And
Sure. In doing the research on the newspapers to see the perception and changing perception as we come through the 80s, it's obviously all about HIV and AIDS, and it's still negative. Another negative perception of Harvey Milk being assassinated. We come into the 90s, it's still negative, and it's Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I was in the military at that time that Don't Ask, Don't Tell came in, and I could say 1 foot in and 1 foot out of the closet at that time, and the 1 foot in was because I'm in the military. And that was a terrible setback for a while, and a very disappointment from someone we expected to do better, but it wasn't the case at the time. And within the military, at least from my perception, it wasn't actually a problem. It's almost like when you're in the closet, you think it's so much worse when you come out, and then when you finally get out, it's like, oh, and wait, it's not that bad after all, right? This is just my experience, perception, not a problem. And I remember my commanding officer came up to me and he says, all I care about is don't be a jerk. You could be a straight jerk and you could be a gay jerk. Just don't be a jerk. In a way, that's educational, refreshing to hear, but it took us a while to come over that, and it was a terrible political compromise. Yeah.
And it really was a compromise. Bill Clinton has acknowledged that it was a mistake now. He thought the best he could do at the time. It was a way to try to provide some protection, but as we know, it led to very uncomfortable situations, discrimination that happened. I think the history in particular for trans service people has been very, very different and very important to cover. And Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a piece of that. But interestingly, from my perspective as a professor, one of the things that was interesting is when that finally ended, when Don't Ask, Don't Tell ended, not only did it on the surface make it okay for service people to be open about who they were, but for example, our ROTC program on campus was able to actually offer trainings and support and information. So not only did it create more openness, but it actually shifted to be policy, to be more accepting and to get more information. And so I had ROTC members before the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell who were definitely afraid to be out and to be open. They were afraid they would lose their scholarship money. They were afraid that they would lose their positions. They didn't feel comfortable. So there was a real shift in how that felt for young recruits, and this is 2000s, right? This isn't, Don't Ask, Don't Tell existed for quite a while. It took a long time for that to go away. So that shift was really great to see, and it really did lead to bigger systemic shifts in the military in the way that these issues were covered. Of course, after that ended, we have still seen repeated attempts to limit trans service in the military, and those have been particularly heartbreaking. Some of those career service members who were told it was okay for them to come out and be clear about who they were, and then suddenly they're under attack, being told they had to leave, being told that they wouldn't have their pension and their service that they'd worked so hard for. So all of those legal battles to try to keep protecting their rights, their benefits, and their ability to serve us are really important, because of course we have always had LGBTQ service members, always. That has been a part of our military history for the entire history of our country, just like every other aspect of our history. And they have served well and loyally and protected our country, so we need to protect them too.
Absolutely. One of the last topics I have on here is, how do you see the community growing moving forward?
So I think what we're talking about now is moving forward is discovering our history. And I have had a couple sessions for a queer history NEPA project. And what I want to encourage people is to bridge that generational divide that happens so much within the gay community, right? Younger guys don't want to have anything to do with older guys, vice versa. But please, people who hear me, if you have a friend in your 90s, 80s, 70s, please do an oral history. I'm kicking myself that I had two gentlemen friends in the age 90 and both died. I did take down notes, but I never did an official oral history. So reach out to the elders in the community, ask them about their experiences, what they lived through, the successes, the disappointments that they have. And then there's other things that we could also do in researching what I would probably call our unsung leaders in the gay community, but we didn't know they were gay and lesbian at the time, but they have left digital footprints and writings behind. And so I have been making it a task of mine to document some people where we're 90% sure, there's all the symbols. There's a book here written about Annette Evans, who was the founder of the Fine Arts Fiesta and the executive director of Little Theater for many, many, many years. And the book talks about, she lives with her companion. And you could do the census research and you find two women of the same sex in the same household. One's called head of household, the other one's called a boarder. It gives you clues, but there's a lot of people that we could research. There's innuendos and anecdotes about so many different people, but they need to be written down. But really, younger people today, reach out to older gay people, interview them, learn from them, and held them up as role models.
I think I agree with Tony's emphasis on learning history. I think it's so important. I think a lot of young adults in our community don't know as much of that history. They may or may not know about Stonewall, but that's often it. And that history has also often been told inaccurately, right? Stonewall's history has been whitewashed quite literally so often. It was Black trans women who were leading Stonewall, and we're finally starting to give them credit for that. But we are failing to protect Black trans women who are alive today, so we're not protecting that legacy. But that history is important to know. It's important to understand if we want to keep moving forward. I also think some of the other shifts that we're seeing, if we're looking at research and data on Generation Z, which is the young adults and teenagers right now. I have a daughter who's 14. She's a member of Generation Z and a member of the community. And what we see there is much more openness of and awareness of gender identity not being a binary. So some recent research has shown that as many as just over half of Generation Z interviewees, or let me try that again. Recent research has shown that just over half of Generation Z, when asked what their sexual orientation is, marks something other than purely heterosexual.
Yeah.
So that is a big number. And if I could pull up a graphic that would show the scale of how that has changed over time, it's pretty significant. And it's because, we are having more availability, more openness, more ability to talk and understand, more visible role models, more representation in media. So all of these things combine to help create more freedom for our young people to be honest about who they are and to explore those things and to learn more. That means we need to give them support, right? It means that we need to be open to bringing them into the community and expanding the community and what the community looks like. It means that we as elders, and I don't know if I want to call myself an elder yet, but those of us who have been here and seen the struggle need to remember that their vision of what it means to be LGBTQ may look very different than what earlier members of the community might have envisioned. And so I think it's really, really important that that young people listen to the elders and understand the struggles and the fight that it took to get here so that they could have those opportunities, but that we also be open to growing and evolving and changing ourselves as a community, because that's exciting. It's exciting to see those possibilities, but we still have a lot of support work to do to get there.
Absolutely. Awesome.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both for your time. Before I let you both loose, is there any closing comments or last minute topics that you guys want to discuss within the topic of the history of the community?
Well, the history of Coming Out Day, how long has it been now? About
When was the first
I think it was an HRC
Yes, it was.
project.
I can't remember the first year. We may have to look that up.
Yeah. We
Stop
don't
and
know.
get our phones out. Are you looking at it? Because I can't remember. And I did know that, but now I can't remember.
But it is such an important day. I can remember at the University of Pennsylvania, where I went to school, they had a Gay Jeans Day. This is in the 80s. And of course, on Gay Jeans Day, everybody wore khakis. It was very interesting to see how people handled it. So, but it's just so unbelievably important to be authentic to yourself, regardless of who you are, what you are, just to be authentic and to be real, and you will be loved, and that's all.
I think since this is for Coming Out Day, it's important to acknowledge that coming out is important, and it's still not always easy, right? We've been talking about this progress. It might sound like, well, it's no big deal now, but in fact, it can be a very big deal, and it can be very, very difficult. So, if some things that I would want people to know about coming out and being out is it's not the same experience for everyone. It's not something you do once. Like, people who don't know think it's like this thing that you do, and then it's like, oh, I'm out of the closet. It's all wonderful now. It's like, okay, do I come out today? Do I come out tomorrow? Like, do I come out at work? Do I come out at my new job? Do I come out to my new friend? How do I come out to my new friend? It's a constant process, and you have constant responses to that process that are all over the place. It's also important to know that it's easier for some people to come out than others, and there's nothing wrong with that, and you shouldn't judge someone for not being out, especially if you're shocked and, well, why didn't you tell me before? It's not that easy. It can be a very difficult thing. It's a very personal thing, and there's a lot at stake. We have protections here in the city of Wilkes-Barre because we passed a non-discrimination ordinance. We've just had some Supreme Court cases that have hopefully provided some protections, but that would probably require some legal action to get those protections. The state of Pennsylvania does not have those protections in place. So there are real consequences for people who come out sometimes. They may lose their jobs, they may lose their home, they may be denied services. So there are reasons why people sometimes don't come out. So, don't judge someone harshly if they've decided not to come out to you right away, or if it's a process. And if someone does come out to you, be supportive and realize that could be a very difficult thing. It may not mean that they need anything from you. It may just mean that they're trying to tell you something about who they are, but it's a big deal. And when we celebrate it on campus, it's still a big deal, Coming Out Day, and we still do fun things. I don't know what we're going to do in the year of COVID to mark Coming Out Day yet, but it's still a very important moment of connection and visibility and pride that we really need.
Absolutely.
And as in terms of other things to walk away with, since I'm an English professor, I'm going to tell you to read. And I'm sure my historian friend here will agree with me.
That's right.
And it's a perfect month to do it.
It is.
October is National LGBT History Month.
That's right. And the Osterhout Library has a wonderful display. You can go and talk to Ainsley or look at the display and check out books if you want to go to the support the local public library. Or you can go to your local bookstore. Especially support independent bookstores. You can do that online even if you don't have one near you. It's really critical, but read.
Wonderful.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for your time today, and thanks again.
Thank you.